Welcome to another edition of The Learning Journey. Wayne Heinzen, your host, with you once again today as we record from Cairns. And we are heading into the HR department, which you might be thinking, that sounds a little bit boring. I promise you it is anything but that, because Lucia Jacobsen joins us today. Hello, Lucia. How are you?
I'm being caffeinated, so I will be really
Yes, you're very good. I don't drink coffee myself, but I see that that coffee looks quite nice. Now, we've got a lot of things I want to cover today. We've only got about 20 minutes, but you grew up as a missionary kid, so we want to talk about that. You've spent some time working in PNG with MAF, so we want to talk about that. You're now in Cairns with HR, so we want to talk about that. But before we get to any of that, talk to us about what schooling looked like for you.
I started out at an international school in Hagen for a year. I actually don't remember how long. It wasn't that long. And then I was homeschooled for a little while. Mm-hmm. And by the time I was sort of preparing to go into high school, we moved to Australia. So I remember homeschooling the most from being in PNG.
Yeah.
Never went to boarding school or anything like that.
Okay. Was there a difference in terms of homeschooling that like really sort of resonated with you? Because I've had my kids in school and also homeschooled, and some have thrived in homeschooling and some actually prefer being at school.
The contrast wasn't so stark until we moved to Australia and I went to a school here. When we moved, I remember being quite frustrated at how long everything took in school. I had gotten kind of into the routine where I was given my tasks for the day and I just worked through them. And if I finished at 10, I finished at 10.
Yes.
And if I finished at 5, I finished at 5. So I remember being quite frustrated when we moved to school and being like, okay, I finished maths. Can I move on to English? And the teacher being like, no. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you feel like that environment where you're done and you want to move on, in terms of like your growth, like was it a barrier, do you think, to your growth? Like did it limit, or it was just a different way of schooling?
Yeah, it was just a different way of schooling. Our schooling wasn't done in a classroom setting, obviously. Yeah. So there were some things that were missing. But the way we were taught and the methods we were used to process information were very similar to Australia. So learning itself, the process of learning, was not hindered by homeschooling.
Yeah.
The one-on-one attention probably worked in my favor. I quite liked it.
Okay. That's good. So you moved to Australia, which is not like PNG, particularly not like the PNG where you were.
Correct.
So what do you remember of that time, like moving to Australia?
I knew it was going to be different from my parents' cultures or the home cultures that TCKs are supposed to kind of semi-identify with. But it was slightly different again because we knew the language of the country we were coming into, so we could at least communicate. Yes. And we looked right in as far as we didn't stand out quite as much in Australia as we stood out in PNG, maybe put it that way. But culturally, it was completely different. It must have been really entertaining for anybody on the outside looking in to see us try and deal with it. Like, for example, I didn't understand the concept of sarcasm at the time because, I mean, my parents use it a lot now, but it wasn't really present when I was small and it wasn't really present in my family. So I remember asking someone who's still my friend today, but at the time it was just a stranger and I just asked her randomly. But I remember her asking her, why are you telling all these little stories that aren't true, but you're laughing at them? So it took me a little while.
Yeah.
It must have been really, really funny to her. But yeah, to me it was just a little bit uncharted territory. I didn't quite know what I was getting into. I could communicate for the most part. And people, when they looked at me, didn't expect something different. I suppose my siblings and I surprised them in how we reacted to things and how we behaved.
So now, a few years down the track, you're older and wiser.
Well, don't know about wiser.
Well, I wanted just to put that out there. But you're an intelligent young lady and
sometimes.
Reflecting, like, do you see that journey different now? Like, as you look back, you know, on the 9, 10, 11-year-old you who's in PNG, in a culture that's different to what you've known, you look different. Like, do you look back and learn anything from that time?
I guess there were some observations that I've been able to make in hindsight. Even things like, at the time I really didn't want to leave PNG because nobody really wants to leave what you consider your home, right?
Yeah.
And I remember thinking at the time it would be better if we go back to somewhere that we know, maybe. So I was expecting, and I think my parents were probably expecting this as well, that we would go back to either the US or Germany, given that those are my parents' home cultures. But that didn't work out, so we went somewhere completely new. And in hindsight, that was really good. It meant that everybody was starting fresh at the same time, because the alternative would have been someone was going home and everybody else was foreign and had to learn how to get used to what would essentially have been a new culture.
Yeah.
So in hindsight, everybody starting fresh was really good for all of us. My parents had prepared my siblings and I quite well for the transition, and because they had made a couple moves in their lives, and because Dad's an MK too, they kind of knew what to expect out of us, which probably made a really big difference for them and for us, but it didn't see it at the time.
Yeah. I wanted you to share your experience as an MK, because there may very well be families that have just arrived in a new country, or they're in the process of getting ready to go to a new country. And for someone that's in that space, I wonder if there's some things that you've learned, some advice that you can share, particularly for the kids that are going into a new environment. Because it's tough for kids, and kids are very durable and they're very adaptable, but they still need to process the difference that is now their everyday.
An observation I suppose I have is the children will cope with most things. They might express themselves in new and potentially challenging ways, but the children pick up a lot more than I think parents realize about everything. So even while we were still in PNG, and this could be a function of how my parents handled it, but I remember being quite aware of what was happening around me in terms of, say for example, security issues, or the reasons why I had to maybe behave a little bit differently to my brothers. Things like that you would expect maybe children to paint over with or look through rose-colored glasses at. It's not a guarantee that they do. I remember before I was going back to PNG a couple years ago, my mother said, just so that you know, this might be a bit of a confronting experience, because you obviously look back on your childhood as a really positive experience, and there might be things that you didn't realize about it at the time that you might have to deal with now as an adult. I tried to take that on board, and I kind of surprised myself in how much I was like, oh yeah, no, I remember this. It maybe didn't impact me in the same way that I have to deal with it now as an adult, but I recognized that it was an issue, and I recognized that I had to deal with it slightly differently. It doesn't seem to matter how much parents or adults try and protect what their children take in. They will experience it anyway, and the way they process it is maybe the part that you have influence over, rather than actually shielding them from things that maybe aren't positive.
You're right, kids are sponges, and they absorb a lot. Now, you mentioned you went back to PNG. So I want to talk about the catalyst for returning to PNG. So you spent a number of years there, up to 11, moved to Australia, studied, and then returned to PNG. Was that always the plan?
No.
Okay.
That was a series of doors opening and being pushed through them and not really having a choice in the matter. But it was okay. It worked out in the end.
Well, it's funny how God uses everything, isn't it, for good.
I've kind of just accepted he's like, that's the door, and then kicks me through.
Yeah.
But it's always worked out. It's always been something good on the other side.
Was there a reluctance return to PNG? I mean,
not at all.
Okay. So what is the pushing then?
So I had never really thought that I would get an opportunity to go back, unless I planned a holiday or something like that. But just because everybody leaves after a while, I didn't really think there would be a point in my life where I could go back, not as a tourist, maybe, let's put it that way. And what I had wanted to do was kind of thinking maybe I could do some volunteering, and I thought maybe I could do something with math, and I wasn't really thinking too hard about it, but I kind of saw this ad pop up for an internship in PNG. So I kind of sent a message on the Facebook and was just asking some questions. And then a variety of things happened. And I think it was Karen here who then reached out to me and said, hey, we saw that you're interested in this, but this is probably not geared towards you, but we have this missions experience placement thing. Would you be interested in looking into that? So we talked a bit more, and that was looking really positive, and then COVID hit. So I went back to uni for a little while. I did honors. And I actually, for that whole period, thought maybe I wasn't going to get a chance to go, just because pandemic made everything really difficult, and I knew that travel in particular, like visas and even just getting flights in and out, was becoming more and more challenging. So I kind of thought, okay, well, maybe I'll find something else then. But towards the end of my honors year, there was a window. We didn't know it at the time, but it was one of those lulls in the COVID lockdowns. So I was in Victoria. State restrictions were just lifting. So I could get from Victoria to Queensland. And once I was in Queensland, I could get a visa for PNG. And I was able to get into PNG just before there was another massive lockdown. So that worked out really well.
Yeah.
And then every other door since has then opened, and I've been sometimes pushed, sometimes gently guided through. But it has worked out really well.
Yeah. So you mentioned a little while back that you remembered a lot when you went back to PNG from when you were a kid. What was different?
So Hagen itself didn't change that much. There was a few new buildings developed and things like that. But like, for example, I walked into Best Buy, one of the grocery stores, and I could still remember where everything was. So things like that hadn't changed a whole lot. But I remember there being a lot more technology. So like when I was a kid, I remember when dial-up came to PNG, and I remember internet being so expensive and so dodgy that like I was still doing research assignments with encyclopedias. But when I went back, everyone had it, not everyone, but a lot of people had a smartphone, and there was more like internet, for example. There was just a lot more technology, even things like cars. There were a lot more cars than I remember there as a kid.
Yeah.
Things like that. So it was interesting to see what had kind of frozen in time and what had just launched itself forward.
Yeah. So what were your observations, and maybe what did you learn from looking at the increase of technology?
It had its pros and cons. So organizationally, you could see that, and it wasn't just MAF, it was most like major organizations were trying to invest in technology and training their staff how to use it, and kind of building these systems according to what maybe their counterparts are in other countries, or like MAF, where we have like MAFI, who sits in the West. Yeah. Towards the end of last year, for example, there was a decent earthquake in PNG. I think it was November or something like that. And it kind of knocked out the fiber optic cable. There was really bad internet, like so bad that we were really struggling to do some basic things. And the IT team here were fantastic. Like they were flying in, doing their best to prop up systems, but it really limited our ability to get anything done. And it's something that I think most people, not necessarily MAF, but most people in the West would really struggle to understand. It's like, oh, okay, well, I have to call this person who sits a couple towns away. I'll just call them, right? When the earthquake knocked out the cell towers, you can't. And if the radio is not working, you can't. You're stuck. You can't actually do anything else. So that was quite interesting. And then maybe culturally, it feels like to me, who is a bit of an outsider, it feels like maybe it was pulled along very quickly. Which meant that there were some people who were very familiar with technology and some maybe very Western concepts of how to do stuff and things like that. But there was also a whole bunch of people who didn't grow up with it and maybe struggled a little bit more to bring themselves up to speed. Yeah, it just brought a whole nother dynamic to trying to work in an international organization where you have so many people in so many different countries trying to work together on stuff that is really massively reliant on technology. Yeah.
So you go back to PNG. From what I understand, a year became 2.5 years.
Yes.
Then you came back to Cairns again.
Yes.
What was different the second time returning to Cairns, if anything?
So I hadn't actually been living in Cairns for quite a while before I came back. I finished high school in Cairns. Like I finished the last 3 years of high school in Cairns because that's when my family moved here. But before that I had been living in Victoria, and then once I finished high school I went back to Victoria. So I had been in Victoria for 4 years before going to PNG, and then I was 2.5 years there. So I hadn't actually seen a whole lot of Cairns. Like I was in high school and I'm a nerd, so I did nothing but study. I didn't see a whole lot of like I didn't go out for dinners or things like that with friends. I went to the cinema sometimes, but like I wasn't going out to the beach or doing anything really that maybe some of my friends and my peers were doing. So it was quite funny to come back and be like, I didn't know that existed. We should go try it.
Oh, that is funny. Hey, our time is coming to an end, and I can't go any further than touch on something you just said. And that was, and I think I'm quoting correctly, I'm a nerd, all I did was study.
Yes.
Tell us why that is something that you invested into. Because we all have the opportunity to decide what we're doing with our hours and our days.
That's true.
Why was it for you that you didn't go and see the sights of Cairns, or didn't do this or didn't do that, and the focus was study?
Somewhat negative, let's put it that way. I'm the bad kind of perfectionist. So I tend to pour myself into things that are probably not that important at the end of the day, because I want a perfect outcome. And at the time, especially school, I wanted excellent scores. I wanted to finish school with a high, it wasn't HR at the time, it was something else. OP. And then afterwards, same thing with university. I was like, okay, I want to do this course. I'm going to do well in this course. So partially, let's say a personality flaw, but also I do actually really enjoy learning. Maybe high school study was a little bit different because I was doing a whole lot of classes that maybe weren't my favorite thing in the world. But as I've gotten older and I've had a little bit more freedom on what I can do or what I can study, I've really enjoyed being able to focus on the things that I find interesting. And it means that like even now I'm picking up bits and pieces and buying lots of books that I haven't finished reading the last lot of books before I buy the next. But yeah, I really enjoy learning new things. And even though I may be a little bit more timid in maybe trying new experiences, I do enjoy it once I kind of get there and I start.
Yes.
Yeah. I do like learning.
Yeah, good. Now, I know I said the last question was the last question, but you said something there and I just want to touch on it really quickly. You said picking up bits and pieces, because one of the things that in the L&D department and for me that we are trying to encourage people is that learning is not just formal. It's not sitting in a classroom. It's not being on Elevate. That you can actually pick up bits and pieces along the life journey. How do you do it?
Oh, okay. So I actually like formal learning. That works really well with my brain.
Yeah.
I like sitting down and studying.
Yeah.
So that tends to be what I do at home. But I suppose in terms of other bits and pieces, trying to find fun ways to learn stuff. So English is my first language, German is my second, and I find reading in German quite challenging because a lot of what I picked up was just spoken. So I'll try and find like Netflix shows and I'll watch them in German so that I can at least pick up a little bit of new vocab and things like that. So it's not so structured and it doesn't feel boring to me. Like I'm still sitting down and enjoying a show, but there's a little bit of extra stuff happening in the background, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think that's a really good insight for people and learning, that it is everywhere if you're actually looking for it and you're deliberate. So I want to say Dankeschön for joining us on the learning journey. That is about the extent of my knowledge in German. Fumpf is the only other one, which I believe is 5.
Correct.
And that's from many, many years ago. But Lucia, thank you so much for joining us on the learning journey. It's been great to chat with you, to hear a bit about your journey, and really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for inviting me.
We love highlighting the stories of MAF staff here on the learning journey, and a big thanks to Cairns-based HR officer Lucia Jacobsen for being our guest today. Now, if you haven't already, why not subscribe to the podcast, and you can also share it with your work colleagues. We're also on the lookout for MAF staff who have a learning journey to share. If that's you or you know someone who has, then please get in touch with us via learning.development@mafint.org. Now, on our next episode of the podcast, we chat with Timor-Leste Country Director Nick Hitchens about what he's learned from leading a team in one of the world's newest nations. We hope you can join us for that. And remember, the dashboard on the Learning and Development SharePoint page will easily point you to some of the resources available to help you reach your full potential.